9:18 a.m., the 43rd floor of Aurora Financial. The air smells like expensive espresso and ambition. Claire Whitmore, the youngest CEO in the company's history, stands at the head of the mahogany table. This is her moment, the merger of a lifetime. Suddenly, the heavy doors burst open. Two federal agents stride in. Claire Whitmore, you are under arrest for federal financial fraud. The room turns to ice. Claire looks at Daniel, her trusted CFO. He slowly stands up, straightens his tie, and points a finger. She did it all. In 6 hours, her world vanished. Everything changed. Claire Whitmore was not just a CEO, she was a force of nature. At 34 years old, she had conquered the most ruthless industry in the world. New York City's financial district was her kingdom. She lived in a world of glass walls, private jets, and black car services. People didn't just respect Claire, they feared her. She was a woman of absolute discipline. Her life was measured in seconds and cents. Every morning, long before the sun touched the tip of the Empire State Building, Claire was awake. She didn't believe in rest. Rest was for people who didn't want to win. By 6 a.m., she was already in the gym. By 6:30 a.m., her black sedan was pulling up to the curb of the Aurora building. This was the routine. This was the ritual of power. She would walk through the grand lobby with its marble floors that shone like mirrors. She never looked down. She never looked left or right. To Claire, the people working in the lobby were invisible. The security guards, the delivery drivers, the maintenance staff, they were just background noise in her symphony of success. One of those invisible people was Marcus Bennett. Marcus was 39, but the hard lines around his eyes made him look older. He was the night shift lead for the building's cleaning crew. While the powerful people of New York slept, Marcus would scrub the stains they left behind. He was a quiet man. He moved with a purpose that most people ignored. Marcus's world was a stark contrast to Claire's. He didn't have a corner office. He had a locker in a windowless basement room. He didn't have a penthouse. He lived in a small, drafty apartment in a forgotten corner of Brooklyn. His life was not measured in millions of dollars, but in the small smiles of his 8-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya was his everything. Since his wife had passed away 4 years ago, Marcus had become both father and mother. His life was a constant battle against exhaustion. He worked 12-hour shifts. He would finish at the Aurora building just as the sun was rising. He would rush home to cook breakfast for Maya. He would braid her hair, walk her to the school gates, and watch her until she was safely inside. Only then would he allow himself to sleep for a few hours before the cycle started again. Marcus wasn't always a janitor. He had a secret that he kept buried under his gray work uniform. Years ago, Marcus was a rising star in data analytics. He was the guy who could find a needle in a digital haystack. But his career ended when he found something he wasn't supposed to see. He found a massive money laundering scheme at his old firm. When he reported it, the people in power didn't thank him. They destroyed him. They forged documents to make it look like he was the thief. He lost his license. He lost his career. He was blacklisted from every financial firm in the country. He took the job at the Aurora building because it was the only place that didn't ask too many questions. He worked in the shadows of the industry that had betrayed him. The worlds of Claire and Marcus were never meant to collide. They were like two ships passing in the dark. But fate has a strange way of leveling the playing field. The morning of the board meeting started like any other. Claire was prepared. She had the data. She had the confidence. The 43rd floor was buzzing with the energy of a billion-dollar deal. But as she began her presentation, the heavy doors of the boardroom swung open with a bang. 2 men in dark suits entered. They showed their badges. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Claire Whitmore, we have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with market manipulation, wire fraud, and falsifying corporate earnings. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire looked around the table. She looked at the board members she had made rich. They all looked away. Finally, she looked at Daniel Rhodes. Daniel was her CFO. He was the man she had mentored, the man she considered her closest ally. Daniel stood up. His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. I'm sorry, Claire. I tried to tell you it was too risky. I couldn't keep your secrets anymore. I've handed over all the logs. I've told the agents everything. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Daniel, what are you talking about? You prepared those reports. No, Claire, Daniel said, looking directly at the agents. I only followed your orders. She was the one who authorized the shadow quichons. She knew everything. It was a perfect execution. In a matter of minutes, Claire was handcuffed. Her assets were frozen by a court order. The board of directors held an emergency vote right there in the room. She was terminated effective immediately. As she was led out of the building, the elevators opened on the ground floor. The lobby was filled with reporters. The invisible people were there too. Marcus Bennett was standing by his cleaning cart holding a mop. He watched as the most powerful woman in the building was escorted out like a common criminal. He saw the fear in her eyes. It was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, but it was one he recognized perfectly. It was the look of a life falling apart in real time. He watched the doors of the police car close. He didn't know it yet, but the fallen queen and the invisible king were about to become the only hope each other had. By 8 p.m. that night, the rain was coming down in sheets. It was a cold, miserable October rain that soaked through everything. Claire was standing on a street corner, clutching her silk coat around her. She had been released on bail, but she had nowhere to go. Her corporate apartment had been locked. Her personal bank accounts were flagged. Even her friends were not picking up their phones. She started walking. Her high heels, which cost more than most people's monthly rent, were clicking against the wet pavement. She walked until her feet bled. She ended up in a small park tucked away between two towering skyscrapers. It was a place for office workers to eat lunch, but now it was empty and dark. Claire sat on a metal bench. She didn't care that it was wet. She didn't care that the wind was biting through her clothes. For the first time in her life, she felt completely hollow. The silence was louder than the city traffic. She wasn't just broke, she was broken. A few yards away, Marcus was walking toward the subway station. He had just finished a double shift. He was exhausted. All he wanted was to get home to Maya, but then he saw her, a lone figure sitting in the dark, shivering under the rain. Marcus stopped. He recognized the coat. He recognized the posture. It was the CEO. He hesitated. Why should he help her? She had walked past him for 3 years without even a nod. She represented everything that had destroyed his own life. He should just keep walking. He should let her feel what it's like to have nothing. But then he thought of Maya. He thought about the lessons he taught her about kindness. He sighed, adjusted his backpack, and walked toward the bench. He didn't say anything at first. He just took off his bright yellow, waterproof work jacket. It was heavy and smelled faintly of floor wax. He stepped forward and draped it over her shoulders. Claire flinched. She looked up, her eyes wide with panic. Who are you? What do you want? Marcus stepped back to give her space. I'm the guy who cleans your office on the 43rd floor, he said calmly. And I want you to put that on before you catch pneumonia. It's a long walk to wherever you're going. Claire looked at the jacket. The neon yellow fabric was a slap in the face to her usual style, but the warmth was immediate. She pulled it tighter. I don't have anywhere to go, she whispered. Her voice was cracking. I don't have anything. Marcus sat down on the far end of the bench. He didn't look at her. He just looked at the rain. I know that feeling. It's like the world is a movie and someone just turned off the sound. Claire turned to him. How do you know that feeling? You're a janitor. Marcus smiled, but there was no joy in it. I wasn't always a janitor, Claire. 10 years ago, I was sitting where you were sitting. Not in a boardroom, but close enough. I was a senior analyst at Sterling Hedge. Claire's eyes widened. Sterling Hedge? That was one of the biggest firms in the city before the crash. Yeah, Marcus said. I pinned a hole in the books, a big one. $20 million was moving through accounts that didn't exist. I thought I was doing the right thing. I took the files to my boss. I thought we'd go to the SEUSE together. What happened? Claire asked, her professional curiosity momentarily overcoming her grief. My boss happened, Marcus said. He didn't want the truth. He was the one moving the money. Within 24 hours, he had flipped the script. He told the board I was the one trying to embezzle the funds. He had the IT department plant evidence on my laptop. I was fired. I was sued. My wife, she couldn't handle the stress. She got sick. We lost our house. We lost everything. Claire was silent for a long time. The rain continued to drum against the neon jacket. Who was he? She finally asked. Your boss? Marcus looked at her then. His eyes were steady. His name was Daniel Rhodes. He was a vice president there before he moved to Aurora. The name hit Claire like a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. Daniel. It was always Daniel. He hadn't just betrayed her today. He had been a predator for a decade. He was a man who built his success on the corpses of the people who trusted him. He did the same thing to me, Claire whispered. He used my digital signatures. He moved the money while I was focusing on the merger. He knew I wouldn't check the subledgers because I trusted him. Marcus nodded. That's his specialty. He finds people who are too busy looking at the big picture to notice the small details. Then he bleeds them dry. Claire looked at her hands. They were shaking. I'm going to prison, Marcus. He has all the evidence. He wiped the main servers. There's no way to prove it was him. Marcus stood up. He looked at the towering Aurora building in the distance. Its lights were still glowing, a beacon of stolen wealth. Actually, Marcus said, there might be one way, but it's going to require you to do something you've never done before. What's that? Claire asked. You're going to have to get your hands dirty, Marcus replied, and you're going to have to trust a janitor. Claire looked at the man in the rain. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about profit margins or market share. She was thinking about justice. She stood up, the oversized yellow jacket flapping in the wind. Tell me what to do, she said. The plan was insane. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing Claire would have fired someone for even suggesting 48 hours ago. The building is under federal lockdown, Claire said, as they walked toward a 24-hour diner to get out of the rain. There are guards at every entrance. The elevators require biometric scans that have probably already been deactivated for my profile. Marcus poured sugar into a cup of cheap coffee. The guards watch the front. They watch the people in suits. They don't watch the service entrance at 2 a.m., and they definitely don't watch the trash compactors. He explained the layout of the building from a perspective Claire had never considered. She knew the boardroom, the executive lounge, and the gym. Marcus knew the veins and arteries of the building. He knew the maintenance tunnels, the freight elevators, and the hidden stairwells that bypass the security checkpoints. Daniel thinks he's safe because he wiped the cloud servers, Marcus said, leaning in. But I've been cleaning that floor for 3 years. I know how Daniel works. He's paranoid. He doesn't trust the cloud any more than he trusts people. He has a physical backup, a shadow server. Claire frowned. Where? I've been in every room on that floor. It's not on the 43rd floor, Marcus said. It's in the basement, room B4. It's labeled as an old HV control room, but the power draw to that room is 10 times what it should be. I've seen Daniel go down there late at night when he thinks no one is looking. He carries a silver briefcase. Claire felt a spark of hope. If we can get into that server, we can find the original transaction logs, the ones with his IP address, the ones that show the money moving before it reached my approval queue. But we have to get in tonight, Marcus said. Tomorrow morning, the feds will start a full forensic sweep of the entire building. If they find that server, Daniel will claim it's yours. We need to get the data first. At 1:30 a.m., they arrived at the back alley of the Aurora building. The rain had turned into a thick mist. Claire was terrified. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Marcus handed her a bundle of clothes. Put these on. It was a spare cleaning uniform, a heavy gray polyester shirt and matching pants, a blue cap, a pair of rubber-soled work shoes. Claire went into a nearby public restroom and changed. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the CEO of Aurora Financial. She saw a ghost. She saw the woman she had spent her whole life trying not to be. Keep your head down, Marcus instructed. Don't make eye contact. If anyone speaks to you, just grunt and keep mopping. People see what they expect to see. They expect to see a janitor, so that's all they'll see. They entered through the loading dock. A security guard was sitting in a booth watching a football game on a small TV. Morning, Jerry, Marcus said, waving his badge. Hey, Marcus, you're late tonight, the guard said without looking up from the screen. Yeah, Maya had a fever. Had to wait for the sitter. Marcus lied perfectly. He gestured to Claire. This is Elena. She's subbing for Rodriguez tonight. He's got the flu. The guard glanced at Claire. She was holding a heavy plastic trash barrel, her face hidden by the brim of her cap. All right, just make sure the 40th floor gets extra attention. Someone spilled a gallon of coffee in the break room. You got it, Marcus said. They pushed the cleaning carts into the service elevator. As the doors closed, Claire let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. I can't believe that worked. Like I said, Marcus whispered. To them, we're part of the furniture. They didn't go to the 40th floor. Marcus hit the button for the basement. The elevator descended into the bowels of the building. The air grew warmer and smelled of oil and concrete. They found room B4 at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The door was reinforced steel. It had a heavy electronic keypad. I don't know the code, Marcus said. I've only seen him enter it from a distance. Claire stepped forward. She looked at the keypad. She thought about Daniel. She thought about his vanity, his obsession with his own history. She tried his old college jersey number. Incorrect. She tried the date he made his first million. Incorrect. She closed her eyes and thought about the one thing Daniel loved more than himself. His daughter's birthday? No, he barely spoke to her. His yacht? The name of his boat, Claire whispered. The Lady Luck. She translated the letters into numbers on the keypad. We handed 239-5825. A soft click echoed in the hallway. The green light flashed. The door swung open. Inside, the room was filled with the blue glow of server racks. It was a high-tech fortress hidden in a dungeon. Claire rushed to the main console. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She was back in her element. She was a hunter again. He's got everything here, she hissed, her eyes scanning the scrolling code. The offshore transfers, the forged signatures. He even kept a log of the bribes he paid to the SES investigators. Copy it, Marcus said, glancing at the door. We don't have much time. Claire plugged in a high-speed flash drive. The progress bar began to crawl. 10%, 20%, 50%. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway outside went black. Then, a single set of overhead lights in the server room flickered on, bright and blinding. I always said you were the brightest person I ever met, Claire, a voice said from the doorway. Claire froze. Marcus stepped in front of her. Standing in the doorway was Daniel Rhodes. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, but he was holding something that didn't look casual at all. A small black handgun. But even bright stars burn out, Daniel said, his voice as smooth as silk. I figured you'd find your way here. You and your little friend. Daniel stepped into the room, the gun pointed steadily at Marcus's chest. He looked around the server room with a look of pride. Do you like it? It cost me $3 million to set this up. It's completely off the grid. No one knows this room exists except me. And now, unfortunately, you too. Claire gripped the edge of the server rack. The feds are going to find this, Daniel. You can't kill us both and expect to walk away. Daniel laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. Oh, Claire, always thinking about the law. By tomorrow morning, this entire room will be empty. A small electrical fire will take care of the evidence. As for you, a disgraced CEO and a janitor with a criminal record, people will think it was a tragic murder-suicide, a desperate woman and her accomplice who couldn't handle the pressure. He looked at Marcus. You should have stayed in the shadows, Marcus. You were doing so well, scrubbing toilets, being a good little father. Why did you have to ruin it? Marcus didn't flinch. Because my daughter deserves better than a world run by people like you. Daniel sneered. He turned his gaze back to Claire. I'll give you a choice, Claire, because I actually liked you. Give me the drive. Right now, I'll let you leave. I have a car waiting. It'll take you to a private airfield. You can go to a country with no extradition. You'll have enough money to live like a queen for the rest of your life. And Marcus? Claire asked. Daniel shrugged, dude. He stays here. He's the scapegoat. It's what he's good at. One life for yours, Claire. It's a simple calculation, the kind you're famous for. Claire looked at the flash drive. The light was solid blue. The download was complete. She held the small piece of plastic in her hand. It was the key to her freedom. It was the key to her power. She looked at Marcus. He was looking at her, not with fear, but with a quiet disappointment. He expected her to take the deal. He expected her to be the cold, calculating woman everyone thought she was. Claire thought about her life. She thought about the penthouse, the private jets, the millions of dollars. She thought about how lonely it was at the top. She thought about Marcus sitting in the rain, sharing his only jacket with a woman who had never even looked him in the eye. She realized that for the first time in her life, she didn't want to win. She wanted to be right. "You're right, Daniel," Claire said. "I am famous for my calculations." She looked him in the eye. "And the math doesn't add up. You're a parasite, and I'm done being your host." In one swift motion, Claire didn't give him the drive. She threw her heavy metal flashlight at the overhead sprinkler head. The glass bulb shattered. A torrent of water exploded from the ceiling. "Run!" Claire screamed. The room was filled with the roar of water and the hiss of short-circuiting electronics. Daniel fired a shot, but the flash of the exploding servers blinded him. The bullet hit a cooling pipe, filling the room with steam. Marcus grabbed Claire's arm. He knew the layout in the dark. He led her through the rows of servers, through the steam and the water, to the back ventilation shaft he had used 100 times for maintenance. They scrambled into the narrow tunnel just as Daniel began screaming in rage. They crawled through the dark, the sound of the water fading behind them. They emerged in the alleyway, 2 blocks away. They were soaked, bruised, and exhausted. But Claire was still clutching the flash drive. "We have to get to the DOJ," Claire panted. "Now." Marcus looked at her. He wiped the grime from his face. "You didn't take the deal." Claire leaned against the brick wall. She looked at the gray sky where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. "No," she said. "I found something more valuable than money." The aftermath was a hurricane. When Claire walked into the Department of Justice at 7 a.m., still wearing her janitor's uniform and covered in basement soot, the agents didn't know what to think. But when she plugged in the drive, the room went silent. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel Rhodes was arrested 2 hours later at Teterboro Airport. He was charged with over 50 counts of financial fraud, attempted murder, and evidence tampering. The shadow server had been his undoing. The news cycle flipped overnight. Claire Whitmore was no longer the villain. She was the whistleblower. The board of Aurora Financial begged her to return. They offered her a contract that would have made her the highest-paid CEO in the world. But Claire walked into the boardroom one last time, not to take her seat, but to hand in her resignation. "You don't get it," she told the stunned board members. "This company is built on a foundation of people you don't even see. I'm not going to spend my life ignoring the people who actually make the world move." Claire used her severance package and the remainder of her legal funds to do something no one expected. She hired a team of lawyers to go back 10 years and clear Marcus Bennett's name. It took 6 months, but finally, a judge vacated Marcus's old conviction. The firm that had framed him was forced to pay a massive settlement. Marcus was no longer a criminal. He was a hero. 1 year later, the sun is setting over the Hudson River. Claire is standing on the terrace of a modest but beautiful office in Dumbo, Brooklyn. The sign on the door doesn't say Aurora. It says Bennett and Whitmore, Ethical Analytics. The elevator dings. Marcus walks out. He's wearing a tailored suit that fits him perfectly. He looks rested. He looks happy. He's carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The Miller account just signed," Marcus says, handing her a cup. "They said they chose us because we're the only firm that hasn't lied to them." Claire takes the coffee. She looks at the man who saved her life. "I remember a time when I thought success meant being on the 43rd floor." Marcus stands beside her. "And now?" Claire smiles. "Now I think success is being able to look the person next to you in the eye." Maya runs out from the inner office, clutching a drawing. "Daddy, Claire, look, I drew our new office." Marcus picks her up, laughing. Claire looks at the city lights. She's no longer the queen of Wall Street. She's something much better. She's a human being. The person who changes your life is not always the one with the most power. Sometimes it's just a single dad who refuses to let the world stay dirty. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who never gave up on you, and subscribe for more Iron Dad stories.